Okay, so let's look at building the database class. So we can use this to query our database from our Google Auth class, which we'll be creating later. Now this is extremely simple, so we're not going to spend too long creating any complex functionality. All we want is the ability to quickly query. Now you might be thinking, why are we creating this inside of a class? Why can't we just put it in init.php, include it in from index.php and be done with it? Well, the point here is that we want to dependency inject this into Google Auth later. And dependency injection is just the ability to pass in a dependency to another class that requires it when we instantiate the object, which can make use of this reusable functionality. And that point there is that keyword reusable. We want this to be reusable. So let's create this. I'm going to call this DB. So I'm going to give a class of DB. Now, I want to maintain a consistent sort of connection to MySQLi, so I'm going to store this in a private property, MySQLi. Now, if you're not familiar with object-oriented programming, this should give you somewhat of an introduction to it because we're going to be working very basically. But basically what we have here is a class which we can instantiate as an object. We'll be doing that later, so we'll see this. The MySQLi property here is technically just a variable, and now what we're going to do is create some methods which are basically functions, and we even call them functions when we use the syntax. So public function, this means that it can be accessed by anyone. Private means that this property is only visible to the current class and no child sort of classes, so when we use inheritance and stuff, which we're not going to be looking at. Now this is going to be a magic method. Now a magic method is something that's already been defined in PHP, and construct is basically what is called when this class is instantiated. So we just basically want to create a new instance of MySQLi here. So I'm going to say this MySQLi. Now this refers to this current object when we instantiate it. So this will now, whatever we assign here, will be stored here. So after we've instantiated this database class, one will now be in MySQLi. We obviously don't want that. We want a new MySQLi instance. Now, your database credentials are obviously going to be different to mine, but for me, my host name under my hosts is localhost. My username is root. My password is root, and we already know that we have a database called website because we set this up earlier, so that is website. So what we're now going to do is create one method which is going to query our database, and it's going to return whether it is true or false, so whether the query succeeded or not. So let's say public function query. Now we need to be able to pass in some SQL to this, so let's put that as a parameter or an argument. And we're going to return the result of this. Remember, again, we're accessing MySQLi here. Query, so that's a method on MySQLi. And we're going to pass in the SQL. And that is our database class complete. We're going to include it now into our initialization file. We're then going to include our initialization file into our index.php file. And we're going to test a query here just to make sure things work. So inside of init.php, what do we need to do? Well, we need to actually include this in, or require this in rather. So I'm going to require once classes/db.php. So now that we've done that inside of index.php, let's require in once app/init.php. So index.php requires in init.php. Init.php requires in db.php. We can now instantiate this and test it out. We're not going to be doing this inside of index later. We're just going to be doing it here to test. If you're not familiar with object-oriented programming, this should give you an idea of why we've created what we have inside of our db.php file inside of this class. So I'm going to say db equals a new db. Now we don't have to pass any property parameters through to this, so we can just leave it as that without brackets. But now what we can do is we can use that functionality. By doing this, what's happened is we've automatically stored an instance of this inside of the private MySQLi property, and we now have access to this public query. So we can pass through a query, and this should execute a query and return true or false. So I'm going to say query equals db query, and I'm going to pass a query into here, and then I'm going to do a var dump on query. That will just tell me what data type this is and its value. So this should be a boolean and true or false. So for the query, let's insert something into our database. Let's get rid of this for now. We don't need this. So we need to insert into our database in the Google ID field and the email field as well. And we'll just put some rubbish in here for now just to test things out, just to make sure that this DB class works. So I'm going to say insert into Google users. I'm going to choose the fields I want to insert, so Google ID and email. And then I'm going to choose the values that I want to insert here. Let's just capitalize this. Values. There. So the values I want is 123 and Alex at codecourse.com. So now that I've done this, let's run this and see what happens. And we get a bool true. So it appears that the query has been successfully executed. Let's prove this by selecting everything from Google users, and you can see that indeed we have a record inserted here. So that is our DB class created. Let's just delete everything from Google users so we don't have that interfere, and we're done. So now that we've done that, we're ready to set up other things, knowing that we can indeed use our database functionality later on.